What's up, everyone? I'm Justin Burkholtz. Thank you for watching. It's time for another book review. This week, I'm going to be reviewing the phenomenal book, The Giza Power Plant by Christopher Dunn. This is super fascinating, and I learned a ton about the Great Pyramid of Giza, so stay tuned. This is going to be a great review. Do me a quick favor, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, hit that subscribe button. I really want to try and grow the channel as much as possible this year, and I need your help to make it happen. So thank you for that, and let's get back to the episode. So as you all know, I have been reading a lot about archaeology lately. My last couple of videos actually focused on books on archaeology. And I have another one here I'm reading on ancient Egypt as well. But in the meantime, I decided to pick up a book that I had heard about recently and have been dying to read, and that was The Giza Power Plant by Christopher Dunn. This is a super interesting book. So basically, Chris tackles the enigma of the Great Pyramid of Giza and asks, what was this gigantic construction project actually for? Was it a tomb? Was it some sort of ceremonial complex? Or did it serve an actual function that gave something back to all the people who spent so much time and effort and energy building the thing? And he breaks down all of the facts about the pyramid to a level of detail I had not seen before and haven't seen anywhere else, actually. So I have long been fascinated by ancient Egypt ever since I was a child. I went to every museum exhibition I could on the West Coast that featured anything from Egypt. I watched every documentary, on Nova or PBS or whatever. I read books, books about ancient Egypt and the archaeology that had been done there. And then as I, grew to be an adult, I've continued to read books about archaeology in ancient Egypt. And even with all of that background knowledge, 35 years of fascination with Egypt, I learned so much from this book. Uh, you know, whether or not I agree with his conclusions as to the function or purpose of the Great Pyramid, I learned more about the pyramid in this book than I had known before from everything else that I had read, watched, etc. So he collects an enormous amount of information in this book. He presents it in a very meticulous and kind of scientific manner. He is, like an engineer, so he's not writing from a historian perspective or like an archaeologist perspective. He is writing from a technical perspective, and that brings a different level of analysis to the pyramid that I've seen anywhere else. And because of that, he actually talks about certain parts of the pyramid that no one else talks about, or he talks about certain discoveries there that I had not heard of anywhere else. The book starts out by talking about the current theories as to the purpose and or function of the Great Pyramid. He discusses the mainstream, historical, archaeological theory that it was a tomb for Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, etc. Each one was a tomb for some pharaoh, supposedly. He talks about the evidence for and against that. He talks about other theories as to the purpose of the pyramids and the kind of pros and cons of those theories as well. Evidence to support, evidence that goes against those theories. And then he presents a ridiculous amount of evidence throughout the rest of the book to argue for his theory that the Great Pyramid of Giza was a functional machine on a gigantic scale that harvested seismic energy from the earth and transmuted that into electrical or microwave energy and then broadcast that somehow for the ancient Egyptians to then use. this seems like a crazy theory at first. And at first I thought, oh, that's silly. It couldn't have been a power plant built, 6,000 years ago or whatever, 4,000 years ago, whatever they say that the pyramid was built. Um, I just thought that seemed too unlikely at first going into it. But he presents a lot of very interesting evidence to support his claims. And I know, because this book was written quite a few years ago, that a lot of evidence has come out since, and he's actually written further books to expand on this theory, including more recent scientific discoveries. But for today, I'm just going to talk about what's presented in the Giza Power Plant. One of the things I really enjoyed about the Giza Power Plant is that the book is just full of just facts, measurements, diagrams, and things like that, so that you really get to kind of get the feel of the Great Pyramid and the chambers and passages inside it without having to be there yourself. I've never had the opportunity, at least so far, to actually travel to Egypt and see the pyramid or any of the other sites there. I really hope I get to someday. But even so, you're going through the book, and every few pages, he has a diagram. Here's one of the coffer they call the sarcophagus that was found in the so-called King's Chamber. Part of the corner is broken off. And so you can see there that he has a diagram with specific measurements, and it's all to scale. And this is found all the way throughout the book. So every few pages, there's another diagram, measurements, pictures, etc. And for each one, see all these? He gives you specific measurements so that he's not just saying, oh, this is a very precise, object or construction. He actually explains to you exactly how precise it is, which is totally mind-blowing, first of all. And he explains some of the challenges that in actually creating something that precise. So this is something most people won't understand if you don't work in precision manufacturing or engineering, which is what he did. So he worked as someone who manufactured parts for things like jet engines and stuff like that, where you have to have very precise manufacturing using very modern methods of manufacturing. And he takes that perspective and he looks at the artifacts and monuments in Egypt and recognizes signs of advanced machining in those objects and talks about what those signals are, how you can tell that it was sawn by a circular saw instead of ground by some kind of powder in a stick or something like that, or a bar, which is how they kind of say that a lot of the stones were cut. And it was how some of the softer stones were probably cut. But when it came to things like granite and diorite, you can't just use the same methods that you can on alabaster or limestone. They're much harder materials, and they can't be cut using the methods that Egyptologists ascribed to the ancient Egyptians. You cannot cut granite or diorite with copper chisels. It can't be done. And you can't produce the signatures in the stones that we see today by the methods that the ancient Egyptians are supposed to have used to cut these stones. It just wouldn't make the remaining signatures that we can see today if they had used the methods that they were supposed to have used. So Chris just asked the question, what were they using then? Based on the evidence that we can see today, based on the measurements we have today, what kind of tools and stuff did the Egyptians use? And so this is one of the early premises he talks about in the book, and it's actually based on a paper that he had written and published previously on ancient machine technology in ancient Egypt. And it becomes very apparent that we don't understand fully ancient Egyptian civilization or their technology. It's very apparent that they had forms of technology that haven't survived to today, that just haven't been found. They had to have had tools that we haven't found yet. And there's a lot of evidence for this. There's tubular drills that were used of some kind in varying widths and diameters and sizes. We haven't found any of those. They obviously had very large circular saws that they used to cut through stone somehow. There's clear evidence of this. We haven't found any of that either. And they had other kind of straight saws and other methods of working stone that had to have existed that we just haven't found any evidence of. Once again, they had to have had something to cut the granite and to carve it and inscribe it. And we haven't found any tools that are actually capable of doing that from ancient Egypt. So it's clear that we're missing some of the picture there. One of the more startling pieces of evidence that he puts forward in the book is actually that there is evidence that the ancient Egyptians knew how to smelt and work with iron many thousands of years before they are supposed to have had that knowledge. And this is very interesting. So I want to read a quick quotation here from one of the appendices to the book, because I think it's really important to show how ideology and prejudice and these outdated kind of dogmas that the Egyptologists and archaeologists adhere to have prevented them from objectively looking at the evidence in front of them. All right, so this is Appendix B, and it's titled Wrought Iron Found in the Great Pyramid. So I had never heard of this before. As far as I knew, I didn't think there was any evidence that the ancient Egyptians worked with iron, especially not in the Old Kingdom period when the Great Pyramid was supposedly built. So this is very interesting. I just want to read this little quotation here. And Chris asks, I'm quoting, "Was copper the only metal available to the ancient Egyptians? Notwithstanding the fact that cutting granite with copper chisels is an impossibility, Egyptologists have asserted that the pyramid builders predated the Bronze Age, and therefore were limited in their choice of metals with which to make their tools. Therefore, they say that copper was the only metal that the ancient Egyptians used to fashion the stones with which they built the Great Pyramid. They say this while evidence of prehistoric iron proving that the ancient Egyptians had developed and used it when building the Great Pyramid is in the keeping of the British Museum." So he goes on to quote the finders for this artifact, who knew that what they found was so revolutionary that they decided they had to go to extreme lengths to certify its authenticity. And there are signed certificates here from multiple people who were there when it was found, certifying, "We examined the place whence the iron in question was taken, and we are of the opinion the iron must have been left in the joint during the building of the pyramid, and that it could not have been inserted afterwards." There's multiple certifications exactly like that here, testimonials that this iron was found inside a part of the pyramid that they only got to when they removed a bunch of stones, I believe by blasting them or something, trying to find more chambers inside the pyramid. And they found a piece of iron deep inside the stone. And interestingly enough, later on, Graham Hancock and Robert Bivall had that piece of iron tested in 1989 by a Dr. M.P. Jones, senior tutor in the Mineral Resources Engineering Department at Imperial College London, and Dr. Syed El-Gayer, who gained his PhD in extraction metallurgy at the University of Aston in Birmingham. And they reported, quote, "It is concluded on the basis of the present investigation that the iron plate is very ancient. Furthermore, the metallurgical evidence supports the archaeological evidence, which suggests that the plate was incorporated within the pyramid at the time the structure was being built." They also determined that the iron was not of meteoric origin and that it must have been smelted at between 1000 and 1100 degrees centigrade. They also discovered the presence of gold on one surface of the plate during these tests. So, there's other evidence also to support the fact that this piece of iron was installed in the pyramid as the pyramid was being built. Now, if the ancient Egyptians had knowledge of how to smelt and use iron and make iron tools, all of a sudden the building of the pyramid becomes a lot easier, still a basically impossible task even today, but a hell of a lot easier than no wheel, no bronze or iron or anything like that, no diamond cutting tools or anything. At that point, it's impossible. It just can't be done the way that Egyptologists say it was done. So there is evidence that there were other kinds of technology, other tools that existed that were used in the building of the pyramid that we just don't really have much evidence of today. The reason for that is that any metal tools like that probably would have been melted down and reused at some point. Maybe the civilization forgot how to use something, or they had no reason to use that tool anymore. They melted it down and made it into weapons or something. That's what typically happens with this kind of stuff. Gold and silver objects don't meet that same fate because gold and silver aren't valuable as actual industrial or tools for war or something like that. They're too soft. They don't make good weapons. So gold and silver objects often last, don't get remelted down because they're made into ornate, beautiful objects that are just admired for their beauty. But practical objects made out of copper, bronze, iron, etc., very rarely survive to today because they were almost all reused. For the majority of the book, however, Chris actually just breaks down each and every fact that has been gathered about the pyramid, and he argues that all of them can be explained by his theory that it was a power plant that took seismic energy from the earth and transformed it into electrical or microwave energy so that could be harvested and used by the ancient Egyptians. He talks about salt incrustations in the lower chambers and the scorch marks in the Grand Gallery. He talks about the fact that there's evidence for a massive explosion that happened in the king's chamber deep in antiquity that caused the walls to shift out and cracked the massive granite ceiling beams there. And the evidence that someone re-entered the pyramid after it had been built to check on the damage, like they somehow knew that the interior had been damaged, and they actually went into the king's chamber and applied plaster onto those cracks in the ceiling beams. Which really begs the question, if this was a tomb that didn't serve any actual function, how would they have known that the interior was damaged? Nothing on the exterior or in any of the other passages was damaged. Why would they have taken all the time and effort to enter it? And why would they repair the cracks in the ceiling? It's just not necessary. It's a tomb. And then he talks about all of the other parts of the pyramid, the shafts from the king's and queen's chamber, how they're built way more with way more difficulty in the engineering and design of them than is necessary if they were for something like a ceremonial purpose or air ventilation shafts, which they clearly weren't that. The design and function of them, I mean, the ones in the Queen's Chamber didn't even go all the way through to the chambers. They couldn't have been ventilation shafts. They had to have served some other purpose. He talks about chemical residues found inside some of the shafts. And he presents all of this with a ton of just facts and data that have been collected by archaeologists over the last over 100 years that they've been exploring and documenting everything they found there. Now, to be fair, a lot of the book is written with just tons of numbers and facts, and it's very technical. at times. And so, it may not be the sensationalist kind of wild narrative kind of book that a lot of people like when they want to read about this kind of stuff. He's really taking this from an engineer's perspective, and he writes like a technically minded person. I thought this was really refreshing because he's not talking about this like a historian or an Egyptologist, because they simply ignore a lot of the data because they don't know what to do with it. They don't have the frame of reference to understand it. They don't have the background to understand that the methods they're proposing are literally impossible. Now, one of the other really interesting things I loved about the book is Chris actually consults stonemasons and quarries and crane operators who are working today, and he asks them about the logistics of the Great Pyramid. At one point, he asked someone, I believe it was in the Indiana limestone quarries or somewhere in that area, and he asked them, okay, if you were to given an order for the 5 million tons of limestone cut into 2 million individual blocks, etc., that make up the Great Pyramid, how long would it take you to fill that order? And what they said is that if the entire industry, so not just that one quarry, but all the quarries in that area of the United States, if the entire limestone industry tripled their output and had no setbacks or malfunctions or other issues that caused any delays, it would take them 27 years just to cut and deliver the blocks. That doesn't even take into account any of the actual building, the leveling of the plateau before they built the pyramid there, the engineering and design of the interior passages and chambers, the perfect alignment to north, south, east, west, the unbelievable precision that our construction projects and buildings today don't even match. So the Pyramid of Giza is an incredible mystery and enigma. It's one of the most amazing things, if not the most amazing things that human beings have ever created. Just the precision alignment of the building itself wasn't matched until the building of the Paris Observatory thousands of years later. The precision on the interior of the passageways and the chambers is unmatched to today. We don't build buildings that straight, that flat, that precise. We just don't do it because there's no reason to. You can't tell by eye. You can't tell any difference if it's slightly less precise. And it doesn't serve any structural function either. So the precision that's seen in the pyramid has to have another explanation. It doesn't make any sense if it was a ceremonial construction or a tomb for it to be built so precisely. And other ceremonial structures and tombs in Egypt are not built that precisely. They're not built the same way. They're just totally different. If you look at the pyramid versus any other tomb, for instance, of any pharaoh in Egypt, all the tombs of pharaohs where we've actually found pharaohs, or the evidence that there was a pharaoh there, they're completely covered in hieroglyphics. They have objects there because it was believed that the pharaoh would need physical objects to take with them into the afterlife. They're covered in all kinds of art and stuff like that. They were really beautiful, vibrant, amazing works of art, these tombs that the pharaohs were buried in, and they were full of treasures and things, and actual sarcophagi and mummies. And none of that is in the Great Pyramid. There's no hieroglyphics, there's no art, really, maybe. There might be some light etching into the walls of the king's chamber that was recently discovered, possibly. But there's no traditional hieroglyphics. There's no burial objects or anything like that found. There's no mummies found, and there's no actual sarcophagi found. granite box that is in the king's chamber that they call a sarcophagus is, well, it's just not a sarcophagus. You can look up any picture of an Egyptian sarcophagus. It's not a big granite box. It's not the right size for a human either. And it's way too difficult of an object to create for that purpose. Once again, Chris Dunn asked a granite quarry, if I were to order a box like this, how would you make it and how much would it cost? And they just said we wouldn't make it. We wouldn't do that because this granite box is one solid, gigantic chunk of granite that they just hollowed out the middle out of. Okay. Today, we wouldn't make anything like that. We would cut slabs of granite, like 5 individual slabs, and we would bolt them together as the sides, the ground, the floor, etc. They just said we just wouldn't make it that way. And even if they were to make it the way we would do it today, it would cost $500,000 or more. Prohibitively expensive, essentially. So the ancient Egyptians were doing things that even today would be unbelievably difficult to do. And they were doing these things, it seems like it was easy for them, or it was just a part of their production, manufacturing, construction process. It wasn't unique. There are these precision granite boxes. There's tons of them in Egypt. It's not just one for one pharaoh or something. There's a whole place called the Serapeum when there's like a dozen of these things underground in weird tunnels. And they're even bigger than the coffer in the Great Pyramid. So the ancient Egyptians were doing things in stones that we really can't even replicate today. It'd just be not practical at all, prohibitively expensive, or logistically impossible using modern methods. All of this was super interesting to me. I'm not necessarily completely sold on the idea that the Giza Pyramid of Giza worked exactly the way that Chris describes in this book, but I think this is by far the best move in the right direction for understanding the pyramid that I have seen. All right, so what exactly is Chris's theory here? How did the Great Pyramid work? How did it turn seismic energy from the Earth into usable, harnessable energy? Well, this is a fascinating theory. So I want to try and break it down as simply and quickly as I can. Please read the book so that you get all of the details, because I can't even begin to start going into all of the specific facts and measurements, all of the technological information he provides about acoustic engineering and hydrogen microwave technology and stuff like that. Look, some of it was honestly beyond my capacity to fully understand. I'm not an electrical or acoustic engineer. A lot of this was really interesting to me, and I had to learn a lot to even kind of understand what he was talking about at certain points. So there were times I would have to look things up otherwise, but he does give he does a good job of explaining the basics. And so the theory comes down to this. These shafts that go into the queen's chamber probably had some kind of liquid in them, some kind of chemicals. There were 2 different chemicals, and they were measured and seeped into the queen's chamber, where a reaction occurred that produced hydrogen gas that would float up into the ascending passage and into the grand gallery. And in the grand gallery, where those notches are in the walls and this really strange corbelled vault ceiling with these panels and everything, that was full of these resonators, Helmholtz resonators they're called. And then that gas would pass through there be excited by all the acoustic resonance happening there, and it would enter the king's chamber, where it would go through a further process of excitation that would actually put pressure on the granite that the king's chamber is made out of, and that granite has a piezoelectric effect when pressure is alternately applied and released from it. This is a known way that we can create electricity from anything that has quartz crystals inside of it, and all of the granite that consists of the king's chamber is at least 50% quartz crystals. It was granite that was brought in from 500 miles away for just that part of the pyramid. The rest of it's built out of different types of stone, mostly limestone. So then the energy was contained, amplified with the resonators in the Grand Gallery, and with the coffer and the design of the king's chamber, and then that energy would have been emitted either through the shafts that come out of the king's chamber or up through the top of the pyramid through the capstone that was supposedly made of gold, which is an excellent conductor. So he talks about that's the process of this going through, but the main source of the energy itself actually comes from the earth, where the pyramid is sitting on. So the pyramid sits on a base of about 13.5 acres. Massive building. And it's perfectly level. And it's built on a limestone plateau where there is water running underneath the limestone there, under the pyramid, deep underground. And because of the water flow, because of the seismic activity of the earth, the vibrations that it picks up from being such a massive, object sitting on the planet, it would actually pick up this seismic activity and then amplify it with all of the processes that I just talked about, the resonators and the granite, etc. And it just amplifies that kind of natural ambient seismic energy and turns it into hydrogen microwave or electrical energy, or both. So I know that was a super quick breakdown of the theory, and I didn't get into any of the specific facts and stuff that back up that argument. That's essentially what he argues for over the course of the book. And so, like I said, please pick up the book and actually read it to understand the power of the argument he's making, because it is built on a lot of evidence, and a lot of evidence and facts that are just often ignored by other historians and archaeologists, who frankly come up with impossible and stupid theories as to how the pyramid was built, what it was for, etc. If you are interested in Egyptology or archaeology or alternative theories of history or electrical engineering or acoustic engineering, I think you would absolutely love this book. It's just totally fascinating. I read it in a couple of days, and I can't wait to pick up Chris's other books where he expands upon this theory, because it really is fascinating, and it's so interesting to hear about these artifacts and monuments from someone with a technical eye for precision and for manufacturing. It's just a very different perspective than you'll hear pretty much anywhere else. So if that sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend that you pick up a copy of the book. I'll have a link in the description for you. And I just hope that you keep an open mind. And, you don't have to agree with his conclusion. Like I said, I'm still not entirely sold yet. We'll see what happens when I read his other books. But nevertheless, you will learn a ton. So if you're interested in learning about any of that stuff, check it out. Okay, well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this review. Check out my other book reviews if you did. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do that. Hit the like button. share, comment, etc. That all really helps me out. The channel's growing quickly right now. I just want to expand as much as possible this year so that hopefully, I can start bringing in a little bit of income to help offset my costs to make these videos and buy all these books, etc. If you want to support me, I have published a couple of books of my own, Foundations and Luna. There'll be links for those down below as well. And I do have a Patreon if you want to support me that way. I appreciate all of your support, whether it's subscribing, liking, or even just watching the videos. Thank you so much, and I'll see you again next week.